Hi everyone, it is Senpai Fanfic back at it with another video. Today we'll be show you what if Deku wasn't quirkless, but had a stockpiling quirk that looks exactly like if he got OFA. Show more videos like this, hit the like button and subscribe with notification on down below, and let's start it. Well now, the first half of the second day of school was pretty normal for school life. Even the teachers being pro-heroes couldn't take away the normalcy of English, math, and other standard classes. It wasn't until after lunch that things got exciting for the students. Izuku had his head tilted back, eyes closed as he stored the photons and minimal amount of heat he could get from the light directly overhead. He wouldn't be surprised if Aizawa had purposefully placed his seat under it, the rational, magnificent bastard that he was. He perked up though when he heard a familiar voice call out from behind the door, "I am here," entering the door like a hero. As the majority of 1A reacted in complete surprise, Izuku watched All Might come jumping through the now open doorway and giving exaggerated steps to the front of the classroom. Reaching the podium, All Might stated, "That is right, students, I am here to teach all of you how to be heroes." And today's lesson, he slammed a card onto the podium, somehow making a louder clack sound without bending the card or damaging the podium, a card with red letters that said, "Battle." We'll be seeing how well you lot can handle the rigors of combat. But before we do that, you must have. All Might clicked a remote and panels slid out of the wall opposite the door, 5 of them holding for numbered cases each. All Might gestured and continued, "Costumes. Each one made to the specifications you sent in." The students cheered and All Might gestured as he said, "Go get changed and then meet me in training ground beta." With that, he turned and sprinted out fast enough to give off a burst of wind. A couple of minutes later, Izuku opened his case in the locker room and grinned at what was inside. Ever since he had learned about DNA doping clothes to be compatible with quirks, he had been storing his hair clippings every time he got a haircut. The result was the incredibly durable yet breathable and somewhat stretchy green full bodysuit that covered feet, hands, and up to the top of his neck, and which had a mix of silver and black lines going along it in a way to give a slimming appearance, while at the same time showing off his whipcord muscles when he flexed his arms. The boots that went over the feet of the bodysuit had been given the same doping treatment, as shown when Izuku popped the tip of a screwdriver out of his shoe before pulling it back into his inventory. As Izuku began stretching to test that he had full mobility, Kirishima looked at him in confusion as he asked, "Hey Midoriya, why are you fully covered like that? Isn't it going to hinder your quirk?" Ida chopped his arm and stated, "I believe that Midoriya's costume has been DNA doped in order to allow him to use his quirk from his entire body while remaining decent." Izuku pointed at Ida with his right pointer finger and said what he said. A moment later, he slipped on the provided green polarized shatter-resistant mask over his eyes before pulling the hood attached to the back of the shoulder area up, throwing his upper face into minor shadow. Izuku gave his right shoe a toe-tapping test, then pivoted into a roundhouse kick, a 3-foot spike of metal shooting out of his shoe bottom, startling everyone else. Izuku held his kicking position for a moment before pulling the metal spike back in and lowered his foot as he said, "Well, I'm ready." "Yeah? Well, I'm now terrified. Why the hell do you have something like that?" Mineta asked wide-eyed, throwing his upper face into minor shadow. Izuku gave his right shoe a toe-tapping test, then pivoted into a roundhouse kick, a 3-foot spike of metal shooting out of his shoe bottom, startling everyone else. Izuku held his kicking position for a moment before pulling the metal spike back in and lowered his foot as he said, "Well, I'm ready." "Yeah? Well, I'm now terrified. Why the hell do you have something like that?" Mineta asked wide-eyed. Izuku gave a dangerous grin and said, "Rambolts and a method to deliver an electric charge from beyond arm reach without shocking everyone around me but the person I want to." He had added that particular piece of metal, which was actually much longer than just 3 feet, and a few similar pieces to his inventory after he slagged the 0-pointer. Not all things he wanted to zap would be made totally out of metal and thus subtractive to his electrical attacks after all. "Damn, I need to get something like that so I don't zap everyone around me either," Kaminari said, holding his hand up and letting a few sparks of electricity out. Izuku studied Kaminari for a moment, shadowed eyes narrowing, and said, "I recommend you go with cable launchers, a collapsible baton, or a collapsible pole sword, maybe even all 3 to cover close, mid, and long range." As Kaminari looked contemplative, Izuku frowned as his gaze went down to Kaminari's shoes and he asked, "By the way, are those shoes capable of grounding you?" "What? Grounding? What do you mean by that?" Kaminari asked, his confusion not giving the others a good feeling. Izuku pulled his hood back down and lifted his mask up in order to give a look to Ida, who Izuku had to somewhat reluctantly admit would probably be the best for this, and said, "The moment class is over, we're bringing him to the support department." "Agreed," Ida said with a firm nod and chop of his arm. "Guys?" Kaminari asked, still confused. "We shall explain after class, Kaminari," Ida said before he looked around and asked, "For now, is everyone ready?" After everyone had given affirmatives, although they all ignored Bakugo's "What does it fucking look like?" 4 eyes. Ida nodded and said, "Then let us not keep All Might waiting." Izuku put his mask and hood back into place before joining the others as they exited the locker room. When they linked up with the girls on their way to training ground Beta, Izuku was again asked about being fully covered. Yaoirozu lightly clapped a hand to her forehead as she bemoaned not having such a suit made so that way she didn't have to expose so much skin. Mineta ranted about how she should keep her costume as it was only to get a tongue slap from Tsuyu and an ear jack to the neck from Gyro. The gloves Hagakure was wearing fidgeted together as she wondered if she could do the same without the costume being invisible all the time and thus impossible to see when trying to put it on, never mind repair if damaged. Izuku wasn't the only one to do a double take when they realized she basically admitted to being almost completely naked, and just shoes and gloves didn't really count as clothing in this case. Ida practically had a stroke at the thought. Needless to say, Kaminari wasn't the only one Ida and Izuku would be bringing to the support department after class. Shortly after that discussion, the students arrived at the entrance of training ground Beta where All Might was waiting. The hero grinned as he stated, "They say that clothes make the pros, young ladies and gentlemen, and behold, you are the proof. Take heart, and know that from now on, you all are heroes in training. You all are getting me all revved up, you all look so cool. Now then, shall we get started, you bunch of newbies?" The students cheered and followed All Might as he walked a little further into the training ground. When they were 5 buildings in, he turned around and gave a gesture as he said, "This will be where your first lesson to be heroes shall take place." Ida rose his hand and asked, "Sir, this is the same place as our entrance exam. Does that mean we will be conducting urban battles again?" All Might held up 2 fingers on his left hand and said, "Not quite. I'm going to move you 2 steps ahead. Most of the villain fights you see on the news take place outside. However, statistically speaking, run-ins with the most dastardly villains take place about it, backroom deals, home invasions, secret underground lairs. Truly intelligent villains stay hidden in the shadows. For this training exercise, you'll be split into teams of good guys and bad guys and fight 2-on-2 indoor battles." "Isn't this a bit advanced?" Asui asked. All Might clenched his fist and said, "The best training is what you get in the battlefield. But remember, you can't just punch a robot this time, you're dealing with actual people now." The students around Izuku all began asking questions and All Might grumbled out, "I wasn't finished talking." When everyone had settled down, the new teacher pulled out a couple of sheets of paper and tapped them as he said, "Here's the scenario, so listen up. In these buildings are fake bombs. One team, designated as villains, must defend this bomb for 15 minutes, while the other team, designated as heroes, must capture it, represented by getting a hand on it. However, the bomb is not the only win condition. Each student will be given a roll of capture tape. Getting this tape around the wrists of a member of the opposite side will simulate cuffing a defeated villain. If both members of a team are captured in such a way, then the other team wins." Putting the paper away, All Might stated, "Time is limited and so we shall be choosing the teams, along with which other team they will face by drawing lots." "Isn't there a better way?" Ida asked. Izuku shook his head and stated, "You won't always have the option of working with people you know in a single agency. Pros often have to work with other groups, either because the trouble spot is between 2 areas of operation or they've been gathered for a special operations unit." All Might pointed at Izuku and said, "Exactly, young Midoriya. Why, back in my days in America, I once worked with a task group that had pulled heroes from 10 different states. Ida put a hand to the chin of his helmet as he said, I see, life can be pretty random at times. He then bowed and said, my apologies for questioning your methods, All Might. Don't sweat it. All Might said with a thumbs up before he pointed at Izuku and said, but before we draw lots, there is something I wish to take care of first. Come forward, young Midoriya. Izuku blinked but separated from the group. As he walked forward, All Might said, we at UA strive to help you become the best possible heroes you can be when you graduate. Thanks to how young Midoriya's quirk works, I am uniquely qualified in helping with a specific part of his. Now then, both hands up, palms to me if you please. Izuku rose his hands up and All Might held up his fists, which then blurred for a moment as he threw 10 rapid punches, 5 per hand, causing Izuku's mental numbers for stored kinetic energy to blast upwards an unbelievable amount. Even though it had already happened once before, Izuku couldn't help but stare at his hands in awe. All Might gave a boisterous laugh and said, if we do that every time you have class with me, I expect by the time you graduate you'll be able to hold up a collapsing building with ease. Several of the students looked amazed, but Bakugo glared at Izuku with grit teeth, while Todoroki watched with narrowed eyes. Yaoyorozu's on the other hand were rather wide as she said softly, I can't imagine how much force he'll have stored if he's taking multiple punches from All Might each week over 3 years. There were various statements of agreement from some of the other members of 1A. All Might got their attention again with a quick clap of his hands as he said, now that that's taken care of, let's draw. After everyone had drawn a ball from a large box, the teams were as such. Team A, Midoriya Izuku and Uraraka Okako. Team B, Todoroki Shoto and Shoji Mizo. Team C, Yaoyorozu Momo and Mineta Minoru. Team D, Bakugo Katsuki and Ida Tenya. Team E, Aoyama Yuga and Ashido Mina. Team F, Sota Rikido and Koda Koji. Team G, Ikaminari Denki and Jiro Kyoka. Team H, Tokoyami Fumikage and Asui Tsuyu. Team I, Ojiro Mashirao and Hagakyu Toru. Team J, Ikirishima Ahiro and Siro Hanta. The reactions of the students to who they were teamed up with were a bit mixed. Yaoyorozu definitely wasn't as happy at being paired with Mineta as he was. But regardless of how they felt, soon all of the teams were together and All Might said, right, now to determine who's fighting who. Reaching into a second box, he said the first hero team is A. Izuku and Uraraka perked up as All Might reached back in and said, and their villain opponents will be D. All Might gave a rare frown towards the ball and dropped it back into the box with a firm nope. There was a collective blink from the class, then Ida began chopping his arm as he said, All Might. You declared the teams would be random, you can't just decide you don't like a matchup and redraw, it is highly unprofessional. All Might looked up from the box his hand was already in again and said, Aizawa told me to keep young Midoriya and young Bakugo separated in my classes. I am not going to ignore that man the very next day after he gave me that instruction. Ida seemed to deflate as he said, oh, I see. Izuku glared back from under his hood and behind his mask, the sparks of electricity coming off his body doing quite well to tell the other students he was doing so and said, no, you got lucky. I wouldn't have had to worry about being punished in this class for giving you the ass whooping you've deserved for the last decade, you arrogant asshole. Uraraka gave a nervous laugh from beside Izuku, warily eyeing the sparks popping around him. Asui looked between the pair and said, looks like Aizawa-sensei is right in not wanting the two of you to have the same match together. It's like looking at a hated rivalry in an anime. Hagakure said in awe. All Might gave a light cough to draw everyone's attention to the ball in his hand as he said Team A will be facing Team C. The rest of the matches were quickly drawn and they went like this. Second match, B vs I. Third match, H vs J. Fourth match, G vs D. Fifth match, E vs F. With the matches set, those not fighting yet were sent to the observation room while the first two teams were brought to the first building set up for testing, Yaoyorozu and Mineta further shown to the room holding the bomb before All Might headed for the observation room. After a few moments of waiting, Uraraka asked, so, how do you want to do this? Izuku considered for a long moment before he finally looked away from the building as he said, Yaoyorozu is probably fortifying the bomb location, and trapping the hell out of it as well in a hope to overwhelm my ability to store things coming at me. She might even set up a gas trap. Uraraka paled at the last bit and Izuku waved a hand dismissively as he said any gas that gets close will be stored as well. He reached over and stored Uraraka's helmet before storing a harness holding an oxygen tank onto Uraraka's back, which was connected to a firefighter's mask held in his hands. Handing it to Uraraka, he said, "There's half an hour's worth of air in that tank, you'll be fine." Uraraka nodded but then frowned when Izuku didn't bring out a second tank and asked, "What about you?" Izuku shrugged and said, "I've got enough clean air stored, I can just release it inside my mouth and I'm good." Uraraka stared and asked, "You can release stuff from the inside of your mouth?" Izuku hummed an affirmative, then cocked his head when All Might said in the he had given them, "All right heroes, you may now enter the building." Putting a finger to the button, he said, "Roger that." Tapping the mask in Uraraka's hands, he silently told her to put it on, and as she did so, he opened the tank's valve and said, "Stay on my 6, make sure they don't try to jump us from behind." Uraraka nodded and followed Izuku into the building. She had to blink when after reaching the first door her teammate brought out a police-style handheld battering ram. Remaining out of line with the doorway, Izuku bashed the door open, waited 5 seconds before giving a quick look in before moving to the next door. On the 5th floor where Yaoyorozu and Mineta were sitting in the bomb room, Mineta stared at the screen showing what a camera Momo had left in the entrance hall was showing. Giving Momo a slightly scared look, he asked, "Am I the only one who finds the fact he doesn't feel the need to have on an oxygen tank and mask like what he gave Uraraka scary?" "Yes, I'll admit that is rather discouraging for that particular plan," Yaoyorozu said, another screen showing a tank hidden in another room on the 5th floor that she could remote activate. There was another crash as Izuku worked his way through the first floor rooms, and she mused, he is being rather careful about not being in the doorway when he forces them open. One would think that with his abilities he wouldn't be worried about anything shot at him. Mineta shrugged and the pair watched as Izuku quickly but cautiously worked through each doorway, Uraraka dutifully keeping her head on a swivel. When he reached the staircase, he held his right hand up in a fist in the classic sign for hold, and then brought out a can and shook it, Uraraka looking at it in surprise. Both Momo and Mineta blinked when Izuku depressed the trigger on top of the can and silly string of all things came out. After Izuku shot it at an upward arc, then a moment later leaned into the doorway and shot it up the stairs, Momo snapped her fingers and said, "He's checking for trip wires." Mineta sighed and said, "So the foam trip wire mine at the 5th floor landing is likely a bust." "So it seems," Yaoyorozu said with a sigh of her own. Eventually Izuku had worked through the rest of the floors and sure enough, his silly string landed on the trip wire of the foam trap but was light enough to not trigger it. A moment later, Uraraka cancelled both of their gravities and the pair used the railing to maneuver over the wire and onto the landing before she returned them to normal. As they entered the 5th floor, Yaoyorozu bit her lip for a moment before she decided to trigger the tank after all. Pushing the remote button, the pair saw a green light appear on the tank while the pressure gauge needle began moving to 0 as the minor paralytic was expelled. Izuku got through 3 doors before he stiffened on the way to the 4th. He frowned and held up a fist again, cocking his head for a moment before he pulled out a massive red hard-covered book of all things and began flipping through its pages. "What the heck is he doing?" Mineta asked with a frown. Yaoyorozu meanwhile looked on in surprise as she said, "That's the big book of gases. It's the most comprehensive guide to both naturally occurring and man-made gas compounds out there." "Quite right, young Midoriya," All Might said with a thumbs up. Mina pouted at not being able to fluster her classmate with what should have been an embarrassing act. Mineta meanwhile was glaring at Izuku as he muttered to himself, "Lucky bastard." Thankfully for the rest of the class, Todoroki soon reached the bomb room and the moment All Might declared the hero team's win, the ice began melting and even outright turning to steam close to Todoroki as he used the other half of his quirk to remove the ice he made since both Ojiro and Hagakyu's feet were trapped in the ice. And they really needed to get Hagakyu more than just shoes and gloves. As those two teams came back into the observation room, Izuku said to Todoroki, "While I can appreciate a rapid resolution, please keep in mind in the future that not everyone in the area you are operating in will have the same cold resistance as you do." Todoroki blinked, took in how Izuku was standing near Tsuyu, then nodded his understanding. Izuku then turned to where Hagakyu's gloves were and brought out a felt blanket and tossed it over as he said, "Here, Hagakyu. Sorry, I can't do what I did with Tsuyu and use my stored heat, but well," Izuku gestured and finished, "I wouldn't know where to put my arms without touching something I shouldn't." A now wrapped up Hagakyu giggled, and the blanket shifted in a way that suggested she was snuggling a little more in it as the invisible girl said, "Don't worry, Izuku, the blanket's good enough, thanks." "And why didn't you give that to Zoom?" Mina asked with a raised eyebrow. Tsuyu pointed at herself and said, "Full body covering wetsuit wouldn't have helped as much, Kiro." Mina pouted and asked, "Can you guys please not take away all the fun of teasing you?" "No, Kiro," Tsuyu stated flatly, causing Mina to pout harder while some of the other students laughed. All Might shook his head with a smile and got the class back on task. Shortly after that, it was the time for the third match and teams H and J followed All Might to the testing building. Like the last two villain teams, Kirishima and Zero decided to make their stand in the bomb room, with Zero making several floor-to-ceiling sticky traps. Izuku wasn't sure why they thought those would do any good in the bomb room itself, though given Asui had her tongue and Tokoyami had dark shadow to reach things out of arm reach. As Asui and Tokoyami were allowed to enter the building, Izuku shifted to be by Todoroki on his right side, since his left side was covered, and when Todoroki looked out of the side of his eye at him asked, "Hey Todoroki, do you think you could give my heat stores a boost sometime soon to help make up what I used earlier? I'll treat you to a meal or something in exchange if you want." Todoroki looked back at the screens and was silent for a few long moments before he said, "Very well, we can do it after school ends. I like soba. I know a place near the school," Izuku said with a nod. The current match went how Izuku figured it would. While Zero had just as much reach as the other team, he could only shoot and forget it with his tape, while Dark Shadow and Asui's tongue could change direction, allowing them to relatively easily get the win. The next match was Team G, Gyro, Kaminari, as the heroes versus Team D, Bakugo, Ida, as the villains. Izuku frowned as he saw Bakugo leave the bomb room after having an argument with Ida. As the hero team was told to start, he crossed his arms and said, "This is a really bad matchup. If she doesn't have Demolition's grade ear protection, Bakugo just has to let off one explosion near Gyro and the hero team is down a member." All Might hummed in agreement even as he kept his gaze on the screens and said, "Unfortunately, bad matchups happen all of the time in the realm of hero versus villains. But we heroes cannot complain about that and wait with our hands in our pockets until someone with a quirk better suited to the job arrives. Instead, we must overcome the challenge." The way the pair seemed to have decided to overcome the challenge was to stay as far away from Bakugo as possible. Considering how Bakugo was stomping around the building, it was actually fairly simple for Gyro to pinpoint his location. The pair were currently on the 4th floor while Bakugo stomped around the 3rd. "They've managed to give him the slip, thank goodness," Hagakyu said, one of those anime clouds of relief coming from her invisible mouth. Pulling the blanket tighter around herself, she continued, "I wouldn't want to face Bakugo either, and I don't even have super hearing like Gyro. His explosions do make him a tough prospect to face in combat." Yao Airozu said in agreement. "Yeah, but it's not very manly to avoid a fight," Kirishima said with crossed arms. Izuku shook his head and said, "The objective of this mission isn't to fight villains, Kirishima, it's to stop the villains' plans of detonating a bomb that would threaten lives. If the best way they can do that without accumulating needless casualties of their own is by avoiding conflict, then that is the option they should choose. They aren't saving anyone if they get taken out of the fight after all." Izuku beamed at All Might, but then his smile took on a decidedly vindictive edge as he said, "That said, Bakugo's going to be absolutely pissed if he misses a chance to rough someone up." All Might's smile in contrast dimmed a little as he said, "Yes, well, while it is not quite as I would put it, I believe you are correct in that young Bakugo would be upset that he did not get a chance to properly participate." Seeing as how Gyro and Kaminari went up one staircase just as Bakugo reached the 4th floor using another, that was definitely appearing to be a likely scenario. It really said something about the explosive blonde when Todoroki of all people stated he should have waited for them to come to him with Ida. Since neither Gyro nor Kaminari have any means of remote action like Tokoyami's Dark Shadow or Shorge's Dupliarms, at least one of those two have to enter the bomb room. Another great analysis, young Todoroki. All Might said with a thumbs up over his shoulder. He watched along with the students as the pair quickly but quietly made their way straight to said ballroom. Gyro held up a fist when they were a few feet away from the door that had been left open and turned to Kaminari and pointed at it. Kaminari grinned and for the first time of the match took point as he snuck up to the door before exploding into motion, running into the room and cutting loose with a blast of electricity that filled the entire room. Ida fell to the floor twitching and Kaminari ran right past him, still pouring off electricity. He only cut it off a moment before his hand touched the bomb. Hero team wins. All Might called out, then winced as he and all of the students saw Bakugo release a pair of explosions and start cursing up a storm. Ignoring that with the ease of experience, Izuku said, "Sir, Ida might be immobile for a while." "Quite right, young Midoriya," All Might said with a nod before he was gone in a burst of wind. A few brief moments later, he reappeared next to where Kaminari was pulling Ida up into a sitting position, startling both them and Gyro, who had been halfway to them from the doorway. After asking Ida if he felt well enough to rejoin the others, and asking Gyro if his heartbeat was stable, All Might picked Ida up like he and his armor weighed no more than a sack of potatoes, then began jogging out of the building, the other two following. Bakugo had an absolutely furious expression on his face when he was collected as well. As they entered the observation room, Izuku brought out a folding chair from his stockpile. But then he eyed Ida, more specifically the mufflers on his back, and stored it again in favor of a padded stool and said, "Here, sir." All Might laughed and said, "Thank you, young Midoriya." Once Ida was settled, All Might clapped his hands and said, "So then, who would like to start us off?" "Yaoyorozu, if I may say something real quick?" Izuku asked the recommended student whose arm was already rising. "Oh, certainly, Midoriya," Yaoyorozu said, lowering her hand. Izuku nodded and turned towards Kaminari and said, "Kaminari, while it was a good call to make on this training exercise, if you're ever sent into a room that you know has a bomb inside in real life, never just cut loose with your electricity like that. There's a more than good chance you'll set it off if you do. You should only use your electrokinesis on a bomb if a bomb disposal tech asked you to, and only how they say to." Kaminari rubbed the back of his head sheepishly and said, "Right, see, a bomb keeps zappage down unless told otherwise." Will said, "Young Midoriya." All Might said with a thumbs up before he asked, "What else?" Bakugo allowed his eagerness for combat to blind him to the fact that his opponents would have to reach a specific location to meet one of their win conditions. Todoroki stated stoically, causing Bakugo to audibly grind his teeth. After the class had discussed the match, the final two teams of Mina and Amar and Sado and Kota left the observation room. Izuku had to blink when the incredibly reticent Kota summoned a massive flock of pigeons to fill the bomb room. Cocking his head, he said, "Hope neither Amar or Mina have ornithophobia or watch the birds." Uraraka gave a nervous laugh and said, "I just hope Amar doesn't go laser crazy on them, or Mina overboard with her acid either. I don't think Recovery Girl wants to kiss a bunch of pigeons." More than one person shuddered at the thought of kissing a bird. As All Might rejoined them, Izuku said wryly, "Sir, the villains appear to have called in reinforcements." All Might gave a boisterous laugh and said, "So they did. Let's see if outnumbering the heroes helps them any, shall we?" With that, All Might hit the buzzer to start the match. Izuku and a few other students winced when Mina's exuberance damaged Amar's cape. As Mina apologized, Tsuyu stated, "I'm glad it was Amar that happened to. My hair's not as easily fixed, and I only have my wetsuit while he has multiple layers." "Yeah, no kidding, I don't even have that," Hagakure said, the blanket conveying her shudder. "That girl is way too free with using a corrosive substance," Ida said with a disapproving frown and chop of his arm. "I hate to agree with the guy, but he's right," Izuku thought to himself. In the end, it turned out that Uraraka needn't worry. The moment the two members of the hero team opened the door, the swarm of pigeons surged forward and the pair ran away down the hall screaming. They actually ran all the way out of the building, and the students and All Might watched, some with sweat drops and others with snickers, as the hero team was chased all over training ground Beta. Will said, "Young Midoriya." All Might said with a thumbs up before he asked, "What else?" Bakugo allowed his eagerness for combat to blind him to the fact that his opponents would have to reach a specific location to meet one of their win conditions. Todoroki stated stoically, causing Bakugo to audibly grind his teeth. After the class had discussed the match, the final two teams of Mina and Amar and Sado and Kota left the observation room. Izuku had to blink when the incredibly reticent Kota summoned a massive flock of pigeons to fill the bomb room. Cocking his head, he said, "Hope neither Amar or Mina have ornithophobia or watch the birds." Uraraka gave a nervous laugh and said, "I just hope Amar doesn't go laser crazy on them, or Mina overboard with her acid either. I don't think Recovery Girl wants to kiss a bunch of pigeons." More than one person shuddered at the thought of kissing a bird. As All Might rejoined them, Izuku said wryly, "Sir, the villains appear to have called in reinforcements." All Might gave a boisterous laugh and said, "So they did. Let's see if outnumbering the heroes helps them any, shall we?" With that, All Might hit the buzzer to start the match. Izuku and a few other students winced when Mina's exuberance damaged Amar's cape. As Mina apologized, Tsuyu stated, "I'm glad it was Amar that happened to. My hair's not as easily fixed, and I only have my wetsuit while he has multiple layers." "Yeah, no kidding, I don't even have that," Hagakure said, the blanket conveying her shudder. "That girl is way too free with using a corrosive substance," Ida said with a disapproving frown and chop of his arm. "I hate to agree with the guy, but he's right," Izuku thought to himself. In the end, it turned out that Uraraka needn't worry. The moment the two members of the hero team opened the door, the swarm of pigeons surged forward and the pair ran away down the hall screaming. They actually ran all the way out of the building, and the students and All Might watched, some with sweat drops and others with snickers, as the hero team was chased all over training ground Beta. As the buzzer rang signaling the end of the match's time, Gyro said, "Well, that happened." It was a very tired hero team that trudged into the observation room a full 7 minutes after the villain team. So I believe it's obvious that young Kota gets the MVP award for his bringing in reinforcements to distract the heroes until the timer of the bomb ran out. All Might stated, and several students nodded. The lesson went on for a few more minutes before All Might dismissed the class and took off running, claiming that he would drop his notes off with Aizawa for review before going on patrol. Izuku watched All Might go before he said, "All right, Class 1A, let's get changed back to our school uniforms, then Kaminari, Hagakure, and Yaoyorozu, if you'll come with Ida and I to the support course, we can sort out your uniforms." "Right," most of the class called out, while Bakugo snarled out, "Don't tell me what to fucking do, you shitty nerd." Ignoring the explosive blonde, Izuku started walking down the training grounds exit, while behind him Uraraka said to Tsuyu, "Wow, Midoriya really has a take-charge attitude, doesn't he?" Zuko walked beside Ida as they lead Yaoyorozu, Hagakure, and Kaminari to the support course. When they reached the door, Ida reached for the handle, but Izuku quickly grabbed his arm to stop him. "Midoriya?" Ida asked in surprise. Izuku shook his head and said, "Trust me." He moved Ida back past the door frame, then pulled the door open, joining the others as he did so. An instant later, smoke came pouring out of the room and the students heard Power Loader berating a student. "Support course has a rather enthusiastic student this year. Happened to run into her once before when I was acquiring a few specialty pieces from her parents' machine shop," Izuku explained before he walked in, storing the smoke as he did so. The other hero course students traded alarmed looks before following him in. As Izuku strode in, he called out, "Power Loader Sensei, we need 2 DNA-doped costumes and a set of grounding equipment." Power Loader turned away from the pink-haired female student he had been berating. Said student perked up and Izuku instantly said, "Not made by you, Hatsume." Hatsume looked insulted as she asked, "Why not?" "Because your stuff tends to explode at least once, and we don't want you blowing a limb off of either yourself or the person the gear is made for," Power Loader said flatly as he moved to join the hero course students. Kaminari was the easiest of the three to settle. A few microfilament wires in his hero costume shoes had it so that way he wouldn't short-circuit himself, and a promise to have a cable launcher, baton, and collapsible pole sword ready in a couple of days before his next heroics class had him squared away. The DNA doping of the two girls' outfits though would have to be done off-site since as tech-savvy as UA was, that required specialized machinery they just didn't have on campus. Not to say they didn't have it, they just didn't have it here given how damn expensive it would be to replace if a support student tried to do a patch or rush job without supervision and broke it. Still, Hagakure and Yaoyorozu were happy with the designs of the bodysuits they came up with, including the close-fitting dope coats that would be added when it was winter time. A pair of hair samples collected later, everything was settled and the students left the support course to head back to their homeroom. Time skip, end of class. As the final bell rang, Izuku stood up and looked towards Todoroki as he asked, "Mind if I invite the others to join us?" Todoroki shrugged and said, "If you wish to buy a meal for the other students, then I won't stop you." Izuku nodded and gave a short whistle that was just loud enough to get everyone's attention as he said, "Hey guys, I'm treating Todoroki to soba in exchange for a refill of my heat stores. If anyone wants to join us, first bowls on me." Uraraka perked up and happily said, "I'll take you up on that offer." "Yeah, free food is free food," Mina said with a happy cheer. The majority of Class 1A gave their own agreements. The only two who didn't were Bakugo and Koda. "Like I'd waste my fucking time eating with you, you fucking nerd," Bakugo barked as he stormed out of the room. Izuku rolled his eyes but remained silent, instead turning his gaze to Koda, who used charades to indicate that he needed to rush in order to catch a train. Izuku nodded and wished him a good rest of the day, a sentiment the others mirrored. As Koda Power walked out of the classroom, Izuku turned to where Aizawa was getting a few papers together and said, "Offers available for you as well, sensei." Aizawa looked up with a tired blink and said, "I appreciate the generosity, but I'm going to have to pass. The videos of your battle trials won't watch themselves after all." Aomar and Mina both gave small twitches, now dreading what their homeroom teacher would think of them running from a flock of pigeons for the majority of their battle trial. "I didn't at least, Kiro," Asui said as she took an empty seat across from them, having heard some of the conversation as she came to their table. Other members of 1A soon joined them at their table, all the tables around theirs, and Izuku kept an ear out as he looked over the papers while eating his bowl of katsudon. Which was great but couldn't beat his mom's, made by Lunch Rush or not. However, lunch was interrupted a few moments later by a loud whistling sound and a voice came over the PA reporting a level 3 security breach which an older student stated meant someone had managed to get onto campus. The students were instructed by the voice on the PA to evacuate and a mob formed as the students panicked trying to get out of the hallway all at once. After the third time Izuku was shoved, he gained an annoyed look and started slapping his hand against students, storing them. Needless to say, this further alarmed the other students who saw people suddenly disappearing, but Izuku rather quickly stored them as well until only Class 1A students were left in the hall. Looking them over, Izuku asked, "Everyone all right? Any injuries?" "Just a sore back for me," Mina stated, similar answers coming from the rest of his classmates. "Good thinking," class representative Uraraka said with a grin and a thumbs up. "Indeed, while normally I would not condone such actions, I must admit it was the best way to prevent the panicking students from hurting each other or us," Ida said with a nod before he glanced out the nearby windows and frowned as he said, "It appears the press triggered the alarm." "Figures," Izuku said, rolling his eyes before he said, "All right, everyone to the evacuation point. I'll let everyone else out once we're there." There was a round of affirmatives, everyone yet again ignoring Bakugo's irritated response, and the students made their way to the evacuation point in a quick but orderly manner. Hound Dog and Cementos were waiting and Izuku quickly explained to them why only 1A had been part of their group. Cementos nodded his approval of his crowd control actions, and soon the stored students were being released in groups of 5, quickly calmed by the teachers then sent to where their class should gather. And he wondered why he got elected. Prez is definitely a natural lead singer, an amused Gyro said to Hagakure, who giggled. Time skip, the next day 12:50. All right class, today's heroics lesson will be covering rescue operations, Aizawa stated. Most of the class became excited at this, but quickly grew quiet when he continued, "Guys, I'm not finished." Once everyone had settled down, he continued, "This training will be taking place on another part of the school grounds, so we'll be taking a bus there. All Might and another teacher will be joining us there. Also, I know everyone is excited about costumes. He clicked the remote that slid out the panels before he finished. It's up to you if you wear them or not, just remember that you aren't used to them yet and they might interfere with your work. Hagakure, while your costume isn't quite ready yet, we did manage to dope the outside layer of a set of sports underwear, so make sure you put it on when you get your gear. You got it, sensei. Hagakure said, uniform arm lifting up, showing she probably gave a thumbs up. Alright, either change into your costumes or your gym uniforms, then meet out at the bus. Aizawa instructed. Time skip, arrival training building. After Aizawa exited the vehicle, Izuku was the first student off the bus, having sat up front as the class representative. Yaoerozu, or rather Yaromomo as dubbed by Mina during the ride, was the last student off. They were met by a hero wearing what looked like a bulky spacesuit with a black-tinted helmet, though they had sturdy-looking boots on their feet. Oh my gosh, it's 13! Uraraka squealed in excitement. The rescue hero lifted her right hand in welcome and said, "Welcome students, I'm excited to have you all here for your first rescue lesson. Let's head inside so that you can see what you'll be working with today." With that, she turned and led the way inside. The class walked along a large walkway until they reached a pair of pillars holding a thin archway near stairs, allowing the students to see several different areas designed to emulate disaster areas. Needless to say, they were impressed. Wow! It looks like an amusement park, Kirishima said in wonder. A shipwreck, a landslide, a fire, a windstorm, etc. I created these training areas to prepare you for dealing with different kinds of disasters. I call it the Unforeseen Simulation Joint. But you can call it USJ. Just like Universal Studios Japan. All of the students thought. Aizawa walked over towards 13 and asked, "Hey, shouldn't All Might be here already?" Let me guess, he booked an interview instead. 13 spoke too quietly for the students to hear, but Izuku saw her hold up 3 fingers, causing him to frown in confusion. Did that mean All Might was 3 minutes out? He supposed he could have been held up helping other heroes on the way to the school, but something about that thought just seemed off. Aizawa grunted and said, "That man is the height of irrationality." A few moments later, he continued, "All right, the clock's ticking, so we should get started." Excellent! 13 stated before she continued, "Before we get started, let me just say one thing. Well, maybe 2 things, possibly 3, 4, or 5. Get on with it." The students called out. "Right," 13 said, straightening up before she continued. "Listen carefully, as I'm sure you're aware, I have a powerful quirk. It's called Black Hole. It can suck in and tear apart anything. Yeah, and you've used it to save people in all sorts of disasters." Izuku said with a nod, Uraraka nodding a lot more and vibrating like a chihuahua given an espresso. Indeed, 13 agreed before continuing, "However, my power could easily kill." That got Uraraka to stop cold as she said, "I'm sure there are some among you with similar abilities. In our superpowered society, the use of quirks is heavily restricted and monitored. It may seem that this system is a stable one. But we must never forget that it only takes one wrong move with an uncontrollable quirk for people to die." Thank you all for watching this video. Check out the maker of the fanfic down below and goodbye.